A Penny for the Blind Man, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins with a single penny, small, ordinary, and seemingly worthless. It was found in the hand of a blind man who sat each day at the edge of the village square, listening far more than anyone ever realized. To the villagers, he was harmless, a quiet figure people passed without thought, dropping coins into his cup and moving on. But when he is found dead under strange circumstances, Miss Marple begins to wonder what the blind man may have heard, and what someone feared he might reveal. A single penny lies beside him, not as charity, but as a clue. As Miss Marple pieces together the fragments of overheard conversations, hurried footsteps, and hidden motives, she realizes the blind man may have known more than anyone imagined, because sometimes those who cannot see notice the truth better than anyone else. Before we uncover what the blind man heard before his death, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1. The Penny in the Dark. The morning it started was the sort of morning St. Mary Mead knew well, cold, grey, and still enough that even the trees seemed to be listening. A pale mist sat low over the hedges, and the road through the village glistened from rain in the night. Milk bottles stood on doorsteps like little glass soldiers, and smoke curled lazily from chimneys as breakfast fires woke the houses one by one. It looked ordinary, safe, quiet, the kind of morning where nothing dreadful ought to happen. And yet, before 8 o'clock, Mrs. Hensley found the penny. She was on her way back from the grocer's, basket on her arm, muttering to herself about the price of butter, when her shoe struck something hard in the mud. She looked down and saw it there, a single penny, old and dark with age, standing almost upright against a stone in the lane. Strange enough that. Coins don't stand by themselves, not unless someone puts them there. Mrs. Hensley bent with a grunt and picked it up, rubbing the dirt from it with her thumb. "Well," she said aloud to no one, "that's queer." It wasn't the penny itself that troubled her. It was where it had been left, right outside Mr. Abel Finch's cottage. Abel Finch was not a man people understood. Blind for 20 years, thin as a rake, with a face like dry paper and hands rough from garden work. He lived alone in the little stone cottage at the edge of the village, where the road narrowed and the hedges grew thick and tangled like old gossip. Children feared him a bit, though they couldn't have said why. Perhaps because of the white stare of his eyes. Perhaps because he always seemed to know who was near before they spoke. He could hear things. That's what people said. Hear things no one else could. A dropped pin, a creaking floorboard, the shake in a liar's voice. Every Thursday, regular as the church bell, Mr. Finch would walk into the village with his stick tapping the stones, carrying bundles of dried lavender tied with string. He sold them for pennies, just pennies, enough to get by. And everyone knew Thursday was today. But the morning wore on. No tapping cane, no blind man, no lavender. By 10:30, Mrs. Peabody at the bakery had noticed. "Funny," she said, peering through the steamed window. "He's never late." "He's old," said Mr. Dobbins, buying bread. "Old folks sleep longer." But Mrs. Peabody shook her head. Not Abel Finch. That man could rise before the sun itself. By noon, talk had started spreading the way it always did in villages, fast, crooked, and growing bigger at every doorstep. Perhaps he'd taken ill. Perhaps he'd gone to visit someone, though no one could think who. Miss Marple heard it over tea. She sat by her front window, knitting a pale blue scarf, her sharp eyes half hidden beneath the rim of her spectacles.
To anyone watching, she looked exactly what she was, a harmless old lady enjoying her afternoon. But her mind was another matter. Mrs. Bantry had come over with the news, breathless as usual. Abel Finch hasn't been seen all day, and there's something odd. Mrs. Hensley found a penny outside his gate. Miss Marple's knitting paused. A penny? Yes, just lying there. Miss Marple frowned slightly. Lying there is one thing, placed there is another. Mrs. Bantry blinked. It's only a penny. Miss Marple gave a small smile. Yes, but small things often carry large shadows. At 3 o'clock, the vicar sent young Peter Wells to check on Abel Finch. Peter was 16, eager, and too curious for his own good. He walked the muddy lane, whistling at first, until the silence around the cottage pressed on him. No birds, no movement, just stillness. The cottage door was half open. That stopped him cold. Mr. Finch never left it open, never. Peter called out. No answer. He pushed the door wider and stepped inside. The room was warm from the fire, but the warmth felt wrong somehow, stale, heavy. And there, in the chair beside the hearth, sat Abel Finch, still, head lowered, hands resting on the arms of the chair. Dead. Peter ran so fast back to the village he nearly lost his shoes in the mud. Within the hour, Inspector Graves was there, heavy boots on the cottage floor, eyes narrowing at every corner. The village doctor stood over the body, grim-faced. Heart gave out, the doctor said, likely during the night. Inspector Graves looked around. No broken locks, no smashed windows, nothing stolen. Or so it seemed. Until Mrs. Weller from next door mentioned the jar. The penny jar, she said. He kept it on the shelf, full of coins. The shelf was empty. Inspector Graves rubbed his chin. Robbery, then. Simple enough. Old blind man dies. Thief takes what he can. Case closed. But Miss Marple, hearing all this later by the fire, felt that quiet itch at the back of her thoughts. Because thieves don't steal penny jars. Not unless there's something worth more than pennies inside. And then there was that penny in the lane. One coin left behind, or left on purpose. Miss Marple stared out of her window into the darkening evening, her knitting forgotten now. Somewhere in the village, someone was frightened. Frightened enough to steal from a dead blind man. Frightened enough to leave a sign behind. And the thing about fear, Miss Marple knew, was this. It made people careless. And careless people left trails. Sometimes no bigger than a penny.
Chapter 2. The Blind Man Heard Too Much. The next morning came sharp and bitter, with frost clinging to the grass and the sky hanging low and white over St. Mary Mead. The news of Abel Finch's death had spread through the village like smoke through cracks in a door. Quiet voices at breakfast tables, hushed talk in the butcher's queue, curtains twitching, people pretending not to stare when the constable passed by. Death always stirred a village, but mystery, that was different. Mystery kept people awake. Miss Marple arrived at Abel Finch's cottage just after 10, her shoes careful on the wet stones, her gloves buttoned neat at the wrist. Inspector Graves was already there, standing in the doorway with his notebook, looking tired and annoyed in the way policemen often did when the facts refused to line up neatly. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said. She gave him a polite nod. "Inspector." He knew better to ask why she'd come. Everyone in St. Mary Mead knew that when something strange happened, Miss Marple had a habit of appearing, as if drawn by it. The cottage felt colder now, even with the fire lit. Death had a way of changing a room. The chair where Abel Finch had died sat empty, pushed back a little from the hearth. On the small shelf beside it was a ring of dust where the penny jar had once stood. Mrs. Weller noticed that at once.
"You're certain it was there?" she asked. Mrs. Weller, the neighbor, nodded from the doorway. "Oh, yes, every day. He kept his coins in it, counted them every evening." "Counted?" said Miss Marple. Mrs. Weller gave a nervous laugh. "Well, touched them, I suppose, being blind." Miss Marple's eyes moved slowly around the room. Nothing looked disturbed, no signs of a struggle. A cup on the table, half drunk, bread untouched. The clock on the mantel stopped at 11:23. That caught her eye. Did the clock stop by itself? Inspector Graves shrugged. "Looks like it." Miss Marple said nothing, but her mind held on to it. Time mattered. It always did. Outside, Mrs. Weller pulled her shawl tighter and lowered her voice. "I heard someone that night." Inspector Graves turned. "Why didn't you say that before?" The woman looked uneasy. "I didn't think it mattered. It was late, near 11. Voices through the wall." "What sort of voices?" "One was Abel's, the other was a man's, hard voice, angry." "Could you hear the words?" She shook her head. "No, just the sound of it, like two dogs circling." Miss Marple looked toward the lane. 11. The stopped clock. The open door. Things were beginning to fit, but badly, like the wrong pieces in the right box. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple went into the village and sat in the tea shop, because tea shops were better than police stations for gathering truth. People talked more freely over cake. It was there she found young Tom Briggs, the butcher's boy, red-faced and fidgeting over his tea. "You were out late?" Miss Marple asked gently. Tom froze. "How'd you know?" She smiled. "My dear boy, mud on your boots from last night is a dead giveaway." Tom looked embarrassed. "I was coming back from the station." "And?" He hesitated. Then it came out. "I saw Mr. Harrow." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Lionel Harrow, the richest man in the village, tall, polished, always smelling faintly of cigars and expensive soap, a man who smiled with his mouth and nowhere else. "Where?" she asked. "Near Finch's cottage, about 11. "Did he see you?" Tom nodded. "He looked at me, funny-like, then walked off fast." Miss Marple thanked him and sat back. Lionel Harrow out walking near midnight, in rain, near the house of a dead man. That wasn't nothing, not even close. That evening, Inspector Graves paid Harrow a visit. Harrow was smooth about it, too smooth. "Yes, I was walking," he said with a little laugh. "Couldn't sleep." "In the rain?" asked Graves. "I find rain calming." A neat answer, too neat. When the inspector left, unconvinced, Miss Marple stayed behind for just a moment, glancing around Harrow's study. And there it was, mud on the carpet, fresh but scrubbed badly, as though someone had tried to erase where they'd been. Back at Finch's cottage, one final thing turned up, a scrap of paper, crushed beneath the chair leg. Inspector Graves flattened it carefully. 3 words. He heard it. That was all. Graves frowned. Heard what? Miss Marple stared at the words for a long moment, and then she understood something cold and ugly. Abel Finch hadn't just been a blind man living quietly on the edge of town. He'd been listening to something dangerous, something worth silence, something worth death. And whoever had come to Abel Finch's cottage that night hadn't come for pennies. They'd come for what Abel Finch knew. And somewhere in that dark little village, the truth was moving around in plain sight, pretending to be harmless. But Miss Marple had seen it now. Or rather, heard it.
Chapter 3. A Penny for the Dead. By the 3rd evening, St. Mary Mead felt different. Not noisy, not wild, but uneasy, like the whole village was holding its breath and waiting for something to crack. Doors shut quicker, curtains twitched longer,
People spoke in low voices at shop counters and then stopped the moment another person stepped near. Abel Finch's death had done what death always did in a village. It stirred up memory, fear, and suspicion. But this one felt worse, because there were questions hanging in the air, and questions had a nasty habit of dragging ugly truths into daylight. Miss Marple sat by her window that afternoon, knitting in her lap, though she'd undone the same row 3 times. Her mind was busy, sorting the pieces: the penny in the lane, the missing jar, Lionel Harrow's midnight visit, the stopped clock, and that scrap of paper under Finch's chair. He heard it. That was the thing. Abel Finch had not seen anything. He couldn't. But hearing was another matter. A blind man's world was made of sound: a cough, a footstep, the shake in a breath. People forgot that. They lied with their faces and forgot their voices could betray them. And Abel Finch had remembered a voice. That evening, Miss Marple asked Inspector Graves to gather everyone connected to the matter in the church hall. It was warm inside, though the stone walls held the chill of winter. The lamps cast long shadows across the wooden floor, and the smell of dust and old hymn books hung in the air. Mrs. Weller sat stiffly in her chair, wringing her gloves. Tom Briggs looked pale and nervous. The vicar stood near the window, silent, and Lionel Harrow arrived last, neat as ever, polished shoes, clean cuffs, and that smooth little smile he wore like armor. Inspector Graves looked at Miss Marple with a doubtful face. He still wasn't certain where she was going with it, but he'd learned enough not to stop her. Miss Marple reached into her handbag and placed the penny on the table in the center of the room. Such a tiny thing, small enough to lose in a pocket, small enough to miss in the dirt. Yet there it was, sitting under the lamp like a witness. Harrow looked at it, and his expression changed for half a second. Barely anything, just a flicker, but Miss Marple caught it. Recognition. That was enough. She folded her hands and began speaking in that calm, harmless voice of hers, the kind people underestimated until it was too late. She explained that the penny was no ordinary coin. It was rare, a minting mistake from years back, valuable to collectors, and valuable enough to tie itself to an old robbery near Birmingham. At the mention of Birmingham, Harrow's face tightened. Miss Marple saw it. So did Inspector Graves. Abel Finch had lived in Birmingham years ago, before the factory fire took his sight. And on the night of that robbery, he'd been nearby. He'd heard voices, men arguing over stolen money, men frightened and angry. And Abel Finch, blind though he became, never forgot voices. That was the heart of it. Miss Marple turned her eyes to Harrow. "You heard him that night, Mr. Harrow," she said, "and when you came to his cottage this week, he recognized your voice at once." Harrow gave a laugh, but it was thin now, forced. "You're making stories, Miss Marple." "Am I?" she asked. Mrs. Weller heard the argument through the wall. Tom Briggs saw Harrow near the cottage after 11. Mud from that same lane was found in Harrow's study. Piece by piece it was there. Not proof on its own, but enough when laid together. Miss Marple lifted the scrap of paper. He heard it. Not saw. Heard. Abel Finch had written that before he died, a last piece of truth tucked under his chair where panic had dropped it. Harrow's face had gone pale by then, the easy smile gone. Miss Marple pressed on. Harrow had discovered Abel Finch still possessed one of the stolen coins. Maybe Finch kept it for safety, maybe for leverage, maybe just as a reminder of a bad night long ago. But Harrow wanted it back, desperately. So he went to the cottage. The argument grew hard, sharp, ugly, and under the fear and pressure, Abel Finch's weak heart gave way. He died in that chair, not murdered by hand, but killed all the same. Harrow panicked, took the penny jar, meaning to hide the coin among the others, but in his rush, one penny slipped loose and fell in the lane outside, the penny that began it all. Harrow stood there in silence, shaking now, his hands no longer steady. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he admitted taking the jar, said he'd thrown it into the river. Inspector Graves stepped forward at once, grim-faced, and placed an arm on his arm. That was the end of Harrow, or so it seemed. Later that night, Miss Marple sat alone by her fire, the penny resting in her hand, warm now from her touch. The case was solved, simple enough on paper. But simple things often lied, because when the police dragged the river the next morning, they found the penny jar, empty, every coin gone, not just the rare one, all of them. And that changed everything, because Harrow had only wanted one coin, one piece of proof, which meant someone else had been there after him, someone who knew what that jar meant, someone who'd taken the rest, and somewhere in the dark lanes of St. Mary Mead, another pair of hands was holding those pennies, waiting, watching, keeping one more secret. If you've enjoyed this mystery, subscribe and leave your thoughts below, and keep your eyes open, because in St. Mary Mead, even the smallest coin can buy a very dangerous silence.